Exciting. How is everybody doing? My name is Arielle Nissenblatt, and today I'm going to be talking about social media for podcasters, some tips for you podcasters out there. But I know some of you are watching on YouTube, some of you are watching on LinkedIn, some on Facebook. I would love to know where you're watching from in the world today, so I know I'm not alone. So please let me know in the comments where you're joining me from, and if you'd like to share, tell me about your podcast. Feel free to share a link. And for our purposes, I am very curious about what you are doing on social media for your podcast. So we're going to get started, and I am going to share my screen so that we can officially begin. Thank you, Shannon. I am very excited to be here with Podcast Movement University. I'm a big fan of Podcast Movement, and I love teaching with Podcast Movement. I've done a few talks at Podcast Movement throughout the years, and I have also done a few Podcast Movement University chats. So thank you, Shannon and the team, for inviting me to do so. Thank you, Todd. Todd is watching on LinkedIn. Where in the world are you joining us from, Todd? And tell me about your podcast. We'd love to know. So today, social media tips for podcasters. Very important topic. Why? Because we are all looking to get our podcast to more people so that they can enjoy what we're making, and so that it's not just your friends and family listening to your podcast, tuning in week after week. So let's get started. Who am I? My name is Arielle Nissenblatt, and I am the community manager at Squadcast. I have this handy dandy scanner here, a QR code. If you want to follow me on Twitter, that is where I'm most active. And if you want to save my email address, you're welcome to do so. I will be talking a lot for the next 55 minutes, maybe a little bit less than that. We'll leave some time for questions. And if you have questions afterwards, I would love to hear from you. We'll leave some time for questions at the end. We'll actually have time for questions throughout. But if you have something that requires my attention to a deeper extent, please feel free to save my email address. And a little bit more about me: community manager at Squadcast, been there for almost 2 years. Squadcast, you'll hear about in just a second. I am also the founder of Earbuds Podcast Collective, which is a podcast recommendation newsletter that sends a weekly email with a theme and 5 podcast episodes on that theme. And each week is curated by a different person. I'm also the co-host of the Sounds Profitable Ad Tech Applied podcast with Brian Barletta. We discuss the business of podcasting. Episodes drop every Sunday. I also help podcasters with PR and marketing, and really just love the podcast space. Try to keep up with everything that's going on. And part of that means listening to tons of podcasts. So I listen to about 30, sometimes 40 hours of podcasts every week. Love them. Learn so much from them, not just from the podcasts themselves, but also from how people do their podcasts. And one of the things that I like to keep up with is how podcasters promote their shows on social media. So I'm going to be sharing some of those tactics today. So what does Squadcast do? Squadcast is a remote recording platform that records studio quality audio and video from anywhere. You can see some images on the side that depict how we do things. V5 of Squadcast is coming very soon. It's called the New Studio and Backstage. So we are revamping a whole lot when it comes to the Squadcast that you know and love. There will be more, and it will be better, and we're really excited to release it later this month. And if you want to learn more about what to expect, on our blog, squadcast.fm/blog, we have a very recent blog post where we share all about what to expect and, most importantly, when to expect it. So what do I do? Like I said, community manager at Squadcast, founder of Earbuds Podcast Collective. I'm obsessed with connecting people. So if you find somebody that you want to connect with and they're in my network and I like you and you like me, let me connect you to that person. I'm very happy to do it. I love to build community. The Squadcast community is a really fun community that I'm building. We have a Slack channel that is active all the time. I have notifications going off in the background right now. Anybody who uses Squadcast is welcome to join the Slack channel, and I'll have a link at the end to how you can join it. It's squadcast.fm/community. We'll have that written up on the screen at the end of this presentation. But in that community, we ask questions, we find guests, we ask to be guests on podcasts, we share our most recent episodes, and we also do Squadcaster specific events. So that is one of the communities that I'm building, and I also love to help people grow their podcasts. One of the ways is through social media. So before we get into everything, just want to share a little caveat to this whole presentation, which is that social media is important, but it is not everything. Social media is important to have. but it is not the be all and end all. And you will find that some podcasters have very robust social media presences, while some do not spend any time on social media at all. Both work. Everybody has a different case. I'd love to hear from folks in the comments how you are using social media. I'm very happy to read your comments out loud and even refer to you when I'm giving examples throughout this presentation. So please feel free to make this an active chat. I will very much include you in my examples. Just going to take a sip of water. So, social media, important, not everything. What do I mean by that? First, what should you expect in this presentation? We're going to talk about why we use social media in general and specifically for podcasts. We're going to talk about why we don't use social media specifically for podcasts. We're going to talk about what to do as a podcaster using social media, and we're going to talk about what not to do as a podcaster using social media. So first up, let's talk about why social media. Social media reminds your listeners that you exist. So say you put out a podcast every week. Your name is Todd Reed. I'm going to use you as an example, Todd. You put out a podcast every week, and that podcast exists on your podcast listening app. And maybe there's a few hundred people subscribed to your podcast, and they get notifications about your podcast that you've dropped a new episode. And that's really exciting. A percentage of those people are going to tune in because they got that notification. Another percentage are going to tune in because they manually go every single week to your podcast and they see that you have a new episode. But for the people who might have listened to your podcast once and didn't subscribe, or for the people who listened to you, Todd, on a different podcast episode, not your own, and then they start following you on Twitter or wherever you're posting on social, and they don't know that you have a podcast yet, if you post on social, it reminds your listeners and your potential listeners that you exist. Amos says, you use Twitter to connect with other indie podcasters. You feel like you found a pretty good group. Instagram, you don't post daily, so you feel like it's a little useless, but Twitter is gold. I completely agree with that, and a lot of my presentation is going to be about Twitter. Are Facebook ads effective from Facebook user? Good question. We'll get into that. You're getting amazing results. That's not, I don't hear that very often. And then Evolving with Etta says, hello, I've always used Facebook and Instagram. However, I haven't uploaded episodes lately because of low engagement. Very interesting. We'll get into all of your comments. Thank you for sharing, and keep the comments coming. So social media reminds your listeners that you exist. Why else do we use social media? To connect with our listeners. So like I said, some of your listeners are going to be so obsessed with you that they want to follow you everywhere. They want to listen to your show when it comes out. Maybe it's once a week, maybe it's once a day, maybe it's once a month, but they want more from you. So they're going to seek you out on social media. They're going to Google your name. They're going to Google the name of your podcast. Hopefully your social media pops up. So it's important to get social media handles that reflect the name of your podcast and your name. It also allows you to connect with them in a way that serves your podcast. So you can ask them, what should I cover next? Or do you want to submit a voice clip? Or what did you like my most recent guest? Should I get more guests similar to that guest? So you can connect with your listeners using social media. Potentially, you can buy ads. I, generally speaking, do not encourage people to buy ads on social media for their podcast to drive people to their podcast. And here's why. When you are on social media, you're scrolling on social media. That's my behavior when I'm on social media. I pick up my phone, I plop down on my couch, and I am scrolling on social media. And my objective right then and there is to be scrolling on social media. It is not so much to be reminded about a podcast that I might want to listen to and then to change up my behavior. Because if I'm going from scrolling, that means I'm going from sitting on the couch to getting up, going for a walk, washing dishes, cleaning my house, doing something else that pairs better with podcast listening than sitting on the couch. Because when I'm sitting on the couch, I can't really pay attention to a podcast. I don't know about you, but I have a feeling that that is the case for a lot of podcast listeners. And with that in mind, my doorbell just rang, so I just got distracted for a second. Excuse me. So with that in mind, I don't recommend buying ads on social media like Facebook or Twitter to drive people to listening to your podcast. However, if you have some other objective tied in with your podcast, so maybe you're selling a course, maybe you want to drive people to your website, maybe it's a brand awareness, not a bad idea to drive people to your podcast website so that they can take part in a call to action that exists on your podcast website. But don't drive yourself nuts if people are not converting from your ads, which is why I don't recommend buying ads, because you can always run non-paid promos on your social media. And we'll talk about that in a second. Why else social media? I mentioned this before, but you can source ideas and you can source guests. Amos made mention before of the fact that Twitter is a gold mine when it comes to meeting other independent podcast creators and creators in general. It really is. If you plug into the right places, you can meet so many other podcasters and so many other creators who are maybe creating shows that are right within your niche or creating shows in adjacent niches that you can collaborate with in some way. And then beyond that, you can find people who are just experts in whatever area you might need a guest in. So really great place to source, guests, to source ideas, and just to connect with other podcasters and potential listeners. Any questions? And I'll just keep asking that throughout because I think some of the comments are a little bit delayed. So just feel free to let me know if you've got any questions as we go. Social media is also really important for social proof, and here is why. If you go on social media and you have tons of followers, that looks good. It's as simple as that. It's a little bit of a vanity metric, but if you have 10,000 followers on Twitter, that's awesome. One thing I would caution against is doing follow for follow. So if you have 10,000 followers, but you're also following 10,000 people, that kind of balances out to nothing. It means that everybody's following you back, and the people who are following you back might not be listeners. They're probably other independent podcasters. So that's just something to look out for is, are the people who are following you actually people who want your content, or are they just doing it to be nice because you did something nice for them? Same goes for follow Friday posts and other types of engagement bait. You want to probably stay away from engagement bait. There are engagement circles that you can be a part of where you all agree to like each other's posts and comment on each other's posts in order to make it look like you have a lot of engagement going on. And what I will say is that, yeah, that's great for social proof. It means that somebody who passes by your profile will see that you have tons of engagement and lots of different followers while you're following the same number of people. But it doesn't necessarily convert for listeners. So I would focus your time on social media more on creating engaging content that is not engagement bait, but is really providing value to the people who might want to follow you because they see you as an expert in your field, and therefore they're going to convert to becoming a listener. Social proof. Lovely. Facebook user asks, is LinkedIn a good source for guests? Of course it is, as long as you're building up your profile in the right circles. It depends what your podcast is about, and it depends how long you've been building up your circle on LinkedIn. So feel free to tell me about what you do on LinkedIn, what your podcast is about, and I'm happy to answer that question in more depth. All right. I believe now we're going to head on over to why not social media, which is one of my favorite sections. All right. Why not social media? Or better yet, better for this conversation, why not to drive yourself nuts with social media? Like I said, I do believe social media is important, but there are other ways to spend your time marketing your show. And I can get into that a little bit, but that is not really the crux of our conversation today. But I'm sure I will touch on it a bit because I love podcast marketing. There are so many places to be when it comes to social media. Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, TikTok. I could go on all day. Snapchat. There's new ones popping up all the time. Pinterest. Name your favorite. The point is there are so many places for you to be spending time on the internet while you probably have a full-time job, while you're spending time sourcing guests, writing scripts, doing all that, while you are, I don't know, having a family, having a life. There are so many other places to be in the world and on social media. So my advice there is to choose wisely. And how do you choose wisely? You don't have to be on all the social platforms. You don't have to be on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and this and that. You can choose by finding out where your listeners already spend their time, where your potential listeners or where your desired audience spends their time, and most importantly, where you want to spend your time on social media. I think that is the most important part. Do you hate Reddit? Then you don't have to spend time on Reddit. Do you hate TikTok because you get addicted to it when you're scrolling? Then you don't have to spend time on TikTok. Some people might say, oh, I have to start incorporating video. I have to be on YouTube. I have to be on TikTok. To that, I say, if you don't have the time to be dedicating to making high quality videos on TikTok and on YouTube, don't do it. Maybe down the line, you want to start an experiment where you do videos on TikTok or videos on YouTube for a few months at a time. Do that experiment, give it your all for 3 months, give it your all for however long you want to plug into it, but give it a significant amount of time so that you know if it's not just a one-off. And if it's not working, reassess in a few months. You don't have to drive yourself nuts with that. There are too many places to be on social media, and I can help you decide where you should be spending time. If you want to share in the comments what audience you're looking to reach. So for example, if you have a food podcast, Instagram is a great place to be because food lends itself to images. We want to see the images that you're talking about. We want to see the food that you are discussing on your podcast. If your podcast is about business, LinkedIn and Facebook are probably a great place to be. If your podcast is targeting Gen Z, TikTok is probably a great place to be. And there are ways to be on TikTok without spending too much time making videos. And we can talk about that offline at another time. Mostly has to do with audiograms and other following trends on TikTok. There are too many places to be. Well, I mentioned this before, but social media does not convert, and it does not convert. I don't mean that completely. What I mean is it is very hard to convert somebody from being a scroller to being a podcast listener. When I'm scrolling on social media, I am not in the podcast listening mindset. It takes a lot for me to see a post on social media and say, I must change my behavior right now and go for a walk or clean my apartment or whatever it is. So don't drive yourself nuts if your social posts that you work really hard on are not converting to listeners. One thing that you can do is use a tracking link, like Bitly has tracking links, Chartable has tracking links, and you can post those on your social posts so that you know when you're posting on social media if those posts are actually bringing you new listeners. And if they're not, then you can reassess. Maybe you change your call to action. Maybe you post less on social media. Maybe when you post on social media, you don't include a link at all because maybe you just want to build up your reputation as somebody who knows a lot about your area of study. And it doesn't necessarily matter to you if it's going to convert because you've done the experiments and you know that it's not necessarily going to. But it's always worth doing the 3-month experiment, assessing, looking at your stats, looking at your website traffic, and then coming back and doing it again and doubling down on what works and shirking what does not. Another reason not to be on social media is that people are mean. People can be really mean on social media. I won't spend too much time there, but if it makes you upset, you don't have to spend time there. And I think that is something that's really important, is that sometimes we think we have to be there for our business. We have to be there because some guru told us that we need to be there. If you don't want to be there, you don't have to be there. There are other podcast marketing tools that you can employ that will make you just as happy, or that will make you much happier because you're not spending time on social media. And if you don't like social media, I'm giving you permission to say goodbye to it. Rachel in the comments says that you are concentrating on Facebook groups. That's a great idea. And I'm curious, Rachel, if those groups are your personal Facebook groups for your podcast, or if it's you joining other Facebook groups. Would love to know. And Instagram. Very cool. All right. Let's go to how you should actually use social media. Todd says, I am getting a bit of a vibe that social media isn't the best medium for podcast promotion. What medium seems to be the best, especially for B&B? Very good question, Todd. I would say social media is important. But again, my big takeaway here is social media is important, but don't drive yourself nuts if it doesn't convert. I'm going to talk to you about how to use social media in a second, Todd, and then we can talk about how to market for B2B podcasts. So how should you actually use social media? Be discerning. Choose wisely, like I said, and that has to do with a lot. That has to do with where you should be spending your time. That has to do with how many times you should be posting, how much time you should be spending behind the scenes making beautiful graphics and assets, how much time you should be spending interacting with other podcasters and other potential listeners is very important for you to be discerning about, because like I said, you want to be using your time wisely. Most likely, if you are watching this presentation right now, I know Podcast Movement University reaches a lot of independent podcasters. You've got a lot of other things going on, so you want to be discerning with your time. Lots of different places that you can spend your time. Be concise and be consistent with your social media content. So what do I mean by that? Let's talk about being concise, being consistent first. So here are some examples of consistency, and I will explain them. On the top left, you'll see the grid for my Instagram for a podcast that I ran called Counter Programming with Shira and Arielle. I ran this podcast in the early days of the pandemic. Started it April 1st, 2020, and ran it until June 2021. The idea was it was counter programming to all of the grim COVID-19 news. But within that, it was punny. What we did was every episode focused on a different type of count or counter. So if it had the word count or counter in the title, it was fair game. You can see here we did crows, the counting crows. We did pedometers or calorie counters. We did Beyonce's countdown. So lots of different things. But you can see here that our colors are consistent, our fonts are consistent, and that is really important for social media. So before you do anything, once you've got your podcast artwork selected, your podcast cover art, go to Canva or go to another tool that allows you to choose templates and choose fonts, and choose those templates and choose those fonts and be smart about them and be consistent with them. So for season 2 of Counter Programming, we stuck with these colors because this was our cover art, Counter Programming season 2. Got a lot of purple, pink, and blue, and then the rest of our social media followed suit. So when we posted on our Instagram grid, it was always in that color scheme. And when we posted on Twitter, we also posted with that color scheme when we made images. Same with Facebook, same with LinkedIn when we posted on LinkedIn about it, which was not very often. A note about font is a design technique is to use a serif font with a sans serif font. So if you're using 2 fonts, which is great because it helps you differentiate and it helps draw the eye to your posts, use a serif font and a sans serif font. And for colors, there are some websites out there that will help you choose which colors go well with other colors. If you don't have that natural eye for yourself and you don't feel like hiring a designer, you can easily search a website. I don't have one off the top of my head, but you can absolutely search for places that'll help you figure out which colors complement each other. So let's talk about being concise. Nobody wants to read paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs about your latest episode. They want to be hooked in pretty quickly, depending on the social platform. So let's quickly go through them. On Twitter, I recommend using threads. We'll talk about that in a moment. And of course, Twitter does not allow you to do paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs unless you use threads. And in that case, I still recommend being pretty concise and writing for people who don't have much time, because most likely they're scrolling. You need to grab their attention. Instagram, you probably want to give some quippy, what is this episode about, and why they should spend their time interacting with you there on Instagram so that they're reminded of it so much so that when they later do have time to listen to podcasts, they're like, oh, I've got to listen to that podcast about the Counting Crows from Shira and Arielle because their artwork and their weird quirkiness was just so exciting to me that I must hear what they're doing. I got to find out what they're all about. Let's talk about LinkedIn. LinkedIn is interesting because that one I do recommend going a little bit longer. And that's because LinkedIn favors thought leadership. They want you to be an expert in whatever it is that you are purporting to be an expert in. So they want you to start with an engagement question and they want you to end with an engagement question. And that's why you see all of those posts on LinkedIn being like, what is the true value of engagement? And then some anecdote about personal life, and then goes into maybe a study with some statistics. And then, so what do you think? How do you like to engage your audience? And that invites me, that taught me something, that drew me in, and then that asks me to engage with the post. And then it's up to you whether or not you decide to link in your post, right? So you can decide however often you want to point directly to your podcast, or to keep building yourself up as somebody who is an expert in that space so that people trust you and over time recognize that you have a podcast. And then they want to engage with you more, so they listen to your podcast. I'm doing the Obama pointing thing. I don't know why I do that. All right, so be discerning, be concise, and be consistent. Use threads. Let's talk about Twitter threads. So I mentioned before that I work with Sounds Profitable, the podcast ad tech newsletter, and now it's a podcast business newsletter as well. Soundsprofitable.com. I recommend subscribing. I run their social media, and in the month of March, we celebrated International Women's Month by starting the month off with a big article featuring quotes from women in the podcast industry. And in order to show off that article, and later we did an episode on that article on the podcast, I made a big thread about it. And I started that thread by saying, here we go, big and important article from the authors. They write about, and then I share what the title of the article is. And then in each subsequent tweet, I shared one of those quotes with a nice looking image featuring the person's face who said that quote. And that made it so that those quote cards were shareable. They wanted to share them because they looked good and they were presented as experts. So that was one of the threads. That's just a thread example. Here is another one, big one for me. At least, yay, Kayla's here. At least once a week, somebody asks me in the real world, whether it's on the phone or in person, wherever it is, somebody asks me how to get more plugged into the podcast space. And I love this question because it means that people want to engage with podcasting beyond just making their show and throwing up a link on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. So I love when people want to get more engaged with the larger podcast space. There is so much to engage with. So I made a mega thread on how to get more engaged with the podcast space. You can find it on my Twitter, which is at Ari this and that. And in this thread, I essentially shared, I think it was like 15 recommendations for how to plug in. So blog posts that you should be reading, people you should be following on Twitter, newsletters that you should be subscribed to, podcasts about podcasting that I think you should be listening to. That is what I shared in that thread. And here's my last example of a thread. I love podcast movement. So I did a big thread on all of the connections that I've made at Podcast Movement over the years. And that was a really fun one to share because it let me think back to my life in 2017 all the way up till now. So I used Twitter to share, information that wouldn't tweet. I used Twitter threads to share information that would not fit in one tweet. Please let me know if you have questions about Twitter threads and how to create them. I'm also happy to show you on Twitter offline. Let me read a bit of the comments. So we've got JMC says, I'm focused on LinkedIn as my pod is tech business focused. Have not done Twitter or Snapchat, have not figured those out yet. I would not recommend Snapchat off the top of my head, unless you're really willing to spend time making content bespoke for Snapchat. Twitter could be worth your time, and we can talk about that later if you'd like. All right, follow accounts in your niche. This is huge. One of the biggest mistakes that podcasters make when they plug into podcasting, like I said, is they plug only into podcasting. You also need to make sure that you're plugging in also to your niche. So this is my example because nobody else gave me an example when I asked for examples. I always, for some reason, my brain goes to beluga whales. So say you have a podcast about marine biology. You are not just going to want to follow other podcasters who talk about other podcasty things. Yes, it's great because they're going to engage with you and you're going to engage with them, and that's good for social proof, and it's good because it makes Instagram, it makes Twitter, it makes LinkedIn, it makes TikTok a fun place to hang out, and you should definitely follow those people, but also please make sure you are following people in your niche. So if you have a podcast about beluga whales, I'm going to want to join this Facebook group, Marine Biology. It has 31,000 people in it. That's awesome. I'm going to want to engage meaningfully with the people who are in that group. Maybe every once in a while there's room for me to promote myself, but obviously not if it's against the rules. I'm going to want to follow this marine biology influencer. To make this presentation, I actually Googled marine biology influencers and I found this person who has 15.2 thousand followers. That's awesome. I'm going to want to engage with that person meaningfully. Maybe I can pitch him if he has a newsletter so that he can include my podcast in his newsletter if it makes sense. I'm also going to want to follow marine biology shitposts on Twitter because it sounds like a fun account. And I want to read that content so that maybe I can think about it, how I can incorporate it into my podcast. But I also want to keep my Twitter, my timeline diverse. So I don't just want it to be me posting about my new episodes. I also want to respond to things happening in my sphere. So my marine biology podcast is not just going to be like, new episode out now. I interview this scientist about this. New episode out now. I talked about water conservation with this scientist or this professor. I also want to go on marine biology shitposts and I want to see something funny that they said, and then I want to respond with my own flavor to it. Rant over about beluga whales, but they will be coming back. Okay. And my golden rule for how you should actually use social media is, amazing, Daniel. We can talk about that in a second. How you should actually use social media. My golden rule is you should give more than you expect to receive. What I mean by that is really exactly what is written. I pump people up more than I post about my own stuff. There's no real ratio for this, but say you log on to Twitter and you're scrolling through your feed and you see other podcasters who are posting about their podcasts, other marine biologists who are posting about their work. Comment, engage meaningfully with those people before you post about your own stuff so that you're building up clout, you're building up goodwill in the space. And eventually people are going to DM you and they're going to ask how to collaborate because they saw that you are a giving person in the podcast space. And if you set a rule for yourself that you want to be posting 5 times a week across all your social channels, but you can't think of what to post, when in doubt, post about somebody else. You can always shout somebody else out. So Kayla really is an awesome person in the podcast space. She writes articles for Sounds Profitable. She writes the Good Data series for Sounds Profitable. Every once in a while, I love to pump her up, and I love to say, I love this article that she wrote, and here's why. And then I can even use her article to say, here's what I got out of this article and how it can help you. Thereby, I am pumping her up. I am shining a light to Kayla, but I am also extrapolating from Kayla's data what you need to know about the podcast industry. So before I go on, let me answer Daniel's comment. Daniel says, one of the reasons that I started my podcast is because I couldn't find any podcasts in my niche. That is okay. There are definitely adjacent niches that I bet you can find podcasts in. And if not, then think about the tone. Think about who you are. Are there other podcasters who are from your university or from your hometown that you can collaborate with in some way? So there's definitely ways to plug in to the podcast space without just following people in the podcast space. Follow people in your niche, follow accounts in your niche, follow ideas in your niche. There are tons of ways to go there. Todd says that is pretty much a good rule for all areas of life. I absolutely agree. How are we doing? We have about a half hour left, 20 minutes left. Please feel free to keep your comments coming, keep your questions coming. I love taking little breaks to answer them. All right. So here are some examples of pump ups that I have done. Over here on the top left, I run a podcast recommendation newsletter. I mentioned Earbuds Podcast Collective. I got 2 Patreon subscribers in one weekend. That was really fun. So just really wanted to shout them out, tell them that I appreciate that they are giving me $2 a month. It helps. And just shouted them out. So thank you, Melissa and Caroline Keel, who hosts Beyond 6 Seconds. Then on the bottom right, I have a friend named Rebecca Seidel. She is an amazing podcast producer. I went to her website because I was curious about what it looked like. And I saw that she had this really awesome graphic that has her name in sound waves. And I was like, that's the coolest thing I've ever seen. So I posted about it because I just wanted other people to know that she's an awesome producer. Then on the bottom left, I work for Squadcast, the remote recording platform. And we love squad shots. So if you use Squadcast and you take a picture while you're in a session, and you share it with us at squadcast.fm/share. We want to share it with the world. We do share it with the world. This is Dead Air Dennis Mailer. He has a podcast called Word of the Day with Comedians, where he interviews comedians and they go through a word in the dictionary and they talk about it and why it's funny. So shouted him out about that. How should you not be using social media? Do not spam your link. Don't go on social media. This is actually manyfold. Okay, so let's start with just spamming your link. There are Facebook groups where people go just to post their link. No one is actually going to those Facebook groups to find something new to listen to. Those are promotion groups where nobody is clicking on links. They are going to those groups literally just to spam their link. It's not doing anything for anybody. Spend your time elsewhere. Twitter, you'll see a lot of posts that say, I'm looking for podcast recommendations, or I just started listening to podcasts. Does anybody have any suggestions? Do not go there and just post your link. I understand that it is tempting to want to go on Twitter and respond to these and say, I have the perfect podcast for you. I talk about business with these people and the interviews are always amazing. Here's my link. You don't know what that person is looking for. So most likely you're wasting your time. If anything, respond to that person and say, what kind of shows are you looking for? And then you can hit them with recommendations for what they're looking for. Build yourself up as a person in the space who knows what they're talking about. And then maybe they're curious about you. They find out that you have a podcast. Maybe they'll check you out. It is much more worth it to spend your time building up your reputation as somebody who is helpful, as a podcaster, as a leader in whatever area it is that you are an expert in, than it is to spend time spamming your link. This also goes to your own posts. So when you're posting about your latest episode, you don't just want to say, new episode out now, listen here. Because I have no idea what that means. As somebody who's just scrolling on social media, I see your name. I see that you're the Beluga Whale podcast, new episode out now, listen here. I have no idea what that episode is about and why it's worth my time. So instead, use Threads. Tell me something interesting about this episode. Open it up with a question. Open it up with a statement, something that's going to make me think or question, so that I can then not resist continuing to scroll on to read more about what your thread is about, so that at the end, I really want to hit that link and listen to your episode right away, or when I get off the couch and go for a walk. So use threads. Do not spam your link. Create thoughtful, engaging content. Actually, a rule that I've recently come up with for myself, or a template that I've come up with, is you can do this once a week. You can do this once a day. I recommend, on Twitter at least, doing one statement, one question, and one thread. So the statement being something matter of fact, something that you believe is true, or that you want to stir up controversy around. Some people do controversy for the sake of controversy in order to get engagement. I don't recommend that, but it is a tactic. One question, it's an engagement question, it's a thought question that you are very curious about, that you could repurpose to eventually be an episode or a blog post or something like that. It'll get people thinking, it'll get people interacting with you. And then one thread. And this is just a way to frame your social content. And there are parallels to this in other social platforms that we can discuss offline. All right. Spamming your link, a no-no. Oops. Another mistake that people make is only using the Apple Podcast link. Your podcast is available hopefully everywhere. Apple, Spotify, Stitcher. I could go on all day. There are so many of them. Once you submit your RSS feed to Apple, most of the third-party podcast listening apps will grab it. So it's also available on Castbox, on Castro, on Pocket Casts, on Radio Public, on Good Pods. I really could go on all day. There are so many of them, new ones popping up all the time. Your podcast does not just exist on Apple Podcasts. So when you're posting on social media and your last tweet in the thread is a link out to your podcast, you want to make sure that that is not just to Apple Podcasts. You want to link out to your website. That would be a great thing because it drives people to your website. Or you want to link out to pod.link. That's pod.link, because that is a place where you can go to see all of your podcasts, any podcast that you want to check out, and all the different players that it's available on. So that's a great thing to send to people, because then they can choose how they want to listen to your podcast. Another place to link out to is Chartable. These are called universal links because they give you access to the universe. That's not really why they're called that, but the universe of listening. So you want to make sure that you're not just linking to Apple Podcasts in your threads, in your Instagram bio, in your bios in general. You want to make sure that you're linking to a place where many people can find your podcast. And this is especially important because not everybody listens to podcasts on Apple Podcasts. Not everybody has an Apple phone. So you're going to lose the Android users. Not to do on social media. We referenced this above, but you don't want to change your font and your colors from post to post. You want to make sure that you're being consistent, that you've chosen a format, you've chosen a style that looks good and shows that you are putting care into each social post, because ultimately that is an indicator that you're putting care into your podcast. And I want to invest time in a podcast that I think you're investing time in. Next up. You do not need to be everywhere all the time. You don't need to be everything everywhere all at once. I think that's the title of the movie. You don't need to be everywhere. Choose social platforms that you like spending time on and go to those platforms. Choose, and if you don't spend time anywhere, you need to be on social media, choose platforms that your audience is on, or that your potential audience is on. And I am happy to discuss this with you offline. Please feel free to get in touch. All right, let's recap. Skipping. Social media can be very powerful, but don't drive yourself nuts if it is not converting for you. That is what I want you to take home from this, is that you should be spending time on social because it is important for you to keep up, because it is important for people to see that you exist. So that maybe if you don't have an episode out for 2 weeks, you can let people know that you don't have an episode out, but that you still exist and there is an episode coming. And that's important. When in doubt, pump somebody else up. That is always an option. Podcast accounts are important. You should be following Podcast Movement. You should be following Earbuds Podcast Collective. You should be following Sounds Profitable, Pod News, different places that are sharing information about the podcast space that are relevant to you. But you should also make sure that you are subscribing to newsletters, following podcasters, listening to podcasts that are in your niche. Beluga Whale, for a reminder, I told you he was coming back. be consistent and make sure that you're making good shit. Make sure that you're making good shit. And you can always get an audit for your podcast. You can always get an audit for your social media. You can always ask a friend or a friend of a friend so that you know that they're going to give you real advice about what's working and what's not working, whether it's your podcast or your social media. What is translating? What is working? What is not working? Make sure that you are asking those questions. And it is also possible to do a self-audit, especially after you hear this conversation. Go through your social media, think about what's working, what's not working, and ask yourself all of these questions. Thank you so much for attending this conversation. I really always love hanging out with Podcast Movement University. It's always a blast. And now I am very happy to take your questions. Before I do, I'm going to address some of the comments here. Let's go up here. So Facebook user, I'm sorry I don't see your name, says, does your approach change if your audience is outside the US? My podcast is esports for entrepreneurs in emerging markets and how they can create jobs. I think it does not change in this situation. You might find out that in the countries that you're targeting, they don't use Twitter as much, or they don't have access to certain social media, or it's really just not popular in certain countries. So you could do some research and just find out, like, is TikTok available in the countries that you're targeting, or is LinkedIn popular among my potential listeners? So it wouldn't, my social media approach would not change in this situation. But it's definitely worth spending the time doing some market analysis. Thank you for that question. Rich says, I love Pod Link. Me too. Love it so much. Next up, question from Facebook user whose name I cannot see. If I'm posting in each platform, is it okay to post the same thing across them? I'm talking about IG, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you so much for asking this. I did not get to it. No, it is not okay. I mean, it's okay generally to post the same gist, but you really want to make sure that you're optimizing your content for each platform. So I kind of mentioned this at the top, but LinkedIn favors thought leadership. They want you to start with a question. They want you to give a statement. They want you to make broad stroke statements about why you're a leader in this space, and then end with an engagement question. Of course, that is not every post should be that, but that, if you scroll on LinkedIn, you'll see that that's what a lot of people are posting. That's what a lot of the viral posts look like. You're not going to want to post the exact same thing on Twitter, because it's going to take you forever to cut all of that down into Twitter. And the same types of posts don't convert the same way, or don't hit the same way across social media, because there are different people hanging out on those platforms at different times looking for different things. So say your podcast is about beluga whales. I would be much more likely to post some of my research if I were a beluga whale podcaster and I just spent some time in Alaska doing research. I would maybe want to post about my experience there with my grad students. I'm completely making this up. And then maybe shout out a few of my grad students, and then maybe end it with something that we learned and something that we're hopeful for. Whereas on Twitter, I might share a statement like, the planet is in trouble, and we just discovered this when we were in Alaska looking at marine mammals. Let's see. So this especially is important, Facebook user, when it comes to image sizes. So make sure when you're creating images on Canva, you are optimizing them for the platform that you're posting them on. Facebook is different from Twitter, is different from LinkedIn, is different from blah, 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 blah. So just make sure you are getting the right dimensions, and you can Google what are the right dimensions, but Canva will also have that for you there. I hope that answers your question. Please let me know. Next up, question, what is a good example of a newsletter you'd recommend? Depends in what category you are looking for. If you're looking for podcast newsletters, I recommend Pod News, podnews.net. I recommend Podcast Movement's daily newsletter. It's PodMove. You can get it at podcastmovement.com, I believe. I'm sure there's a more direct website, but those are great podcast industry newsletters. Sounds Profitable is another one, soundsprofitable.com. I have to shout out my own newsletter. It's a podcast recommendation newsletter. You can get it at earbuds.audio. There are so many great newsletters out there. I recommend subscribing to podcast recommendation newsletters and podcast industry newsletters. Podcast recommendation newsletters, because then you'll find out what other shows are out there that you should be collaborating with, or that you should be diverging your content from, to make sure it's not the exact same thing. Podcast industry newsletters, so that you know what's going on in the business that you are now a part of. And because if you learn about something like a trend that's going on, you can react to it. So for example, we learned over the past few months that video is getting to be a big thing and you might need to be making video for your podcast. These are what these newsletters are going to tell you about, and then you can make informed decisions. Newsletters in a specific niche, I'm happy to answer if you want to further your question. All right, Rachel says, great info, thank you. Thank you so much for saying that. You are Tom Leonard, very good. Hello, Tom, glad to meet you. Let's see. Brad says, is TikTok worth using if I don't have a video podcast? Totally up to you. There are so many factors. I cannot give you an answer by only knowing your name. Here is what I can tell you. It is always worth experimenting if you have the time to put into the experiment. I would first, before you do anything, become a viewer, become a student before you become a creator. So spend some time on TikTok. Warning, you will get addicted, but you will also find out about the trends, and then you can respond to the trends with your own niche content. Okay, yes. To answer your question, to re-answer your question, Facebook user, I mean the same topic, different style. Yes, you can absolutely repurpose your content from social platform to social platform, but I would change the hooks. I would change the calls to action. I would play around with different things. Amos, or is it Amos? Please feel free to let me know. What about newsletters in entrepreneurship? I recommend a Marketing Brew. I recommend Snacks Daily. It might have changed because that recently changed, but really big fan of Marketing Brew or Morning Brew. And then the good news is that you can subscribe to these newsletters, and the people that are advertising in them are probably similar. So you'll find other newsletters to subscribe to. But if you Google the phrase best entrepreneurship newsletters, you'll also find some great things there. Carolyn Cohen, hi, good to see you again. Any tips on sharing content assets with guests in the hopes that they'll share? Yes, I just did a tweet thread about this today. You can check it out at Ari this and that. Basically, Amos, okay, very good. Basically, here's my advice about getting guests to share Ask them while you're still on the call with them, not if they'll share, but where their audience lives. Where are they most likely to share? Where are they most active? Because you don't want to create assets. You don't want to ask them to share on TikTok if they don't have TikTok, or if they don't talk about the things that they talked about on your podcast on their TikTok. Recently, somebody asked me to be a guest on their podcast, and I said yes. And then he said, will you share it on TikTok? And I said, no, because my TikTok is really that's not what that's for. My TikTok is not big. You don't want me to share it on TikTok. You want me to share it on Twitter. You want me to share it on Instagram. You want me to share it on Facebook. Happy to do that because you asked, but TikTok doesn't really make sense. So ask them in advance where they are most likely to share, and then only create assets for that place and say, hey, I made you a Twitter image, and here's some copy for you to post on Twitter because you said that Twitter is where you like to spend your time and where your audience hangs out. Another thing is to make sure that you have their most updated headshot, because I am not likely to want to share an image that was created for me of an old headshot from 2018, which is the one that people for some reason always love to use for me. Ask me specifically which headshot they want me to use, and ask me specifically which headshot I like and which bio is most up to date so that you're getting the correct information. And then don't be upset if they don't share, because ultimately maybe they forgot, maybe they don't want to. But even if they do share, most likely it's not going to drive so many new listens. So it's worth saving the why didn't you share and just not doing that, and just asking nicely if they will share. And if they don't, okay, hands off. Thank you for the question, but feel free if I think I said that a little bit more succinctly in my Twitter thread, so you can check that out at Ari this and that. Happy to take more questions, but in the meantime, if you're a Squadcaster or if you're interested in Squadcast, you can learn more about the Squadcast community at squadcast.fm/community. We have a Slack channel, we have Facebook groups, we have lots of ways for you to stay engaged with the Squadcast community, but also the podcast community in general. I really like to share within the Squadcast community about what is going on in podcasting and how it can help you become a better creator who reaches more people, who reaches your target audience. Squadcast.fm/community. And did I have that slide twice? No, I had thank you, and then I had questions. Lovely. And here is my QR code if you want to scan me so that you can become my friend on Twitter, and my email address if you have questions. I went on longer than I thought I would. That was good. Thank you, Daniel. And thank you all for watching wherever it is that you're watching. And please connect with me elsewhere. Let me know that you watched this. Take a screenshot and post it, and I'll retweet it. Shannon, I think we're good to go. But if there are any other questions, happy to answer.